And oh, there we go. And if anyone has any technical issues and you try and rejoin but are unsuccessful in that, please be assured that we will be making the recording available and sent it to all attendees next week. So please don't worry if you have a technical failure, as we often have in these days of Zoom. So what we're going to be doing today is we're going to be, first of all, playing a very short video about what the menopause is. And then I'm going to go into just some short, a short overview based on research that I've been conducting for about 10 years now on menopause in the workplace, giving us an overview about what we know and what we don't know about menopause in the workplace. And then we're going to be hearing from Lindsay, who's going to be looking at some of the practical steps that we can take to support employees experiencing menopause. And then Gillian's going to be giving us some fantastic insight into her experience of delivering workplace support surrounding menopausal transition. And then we're going to be going into a panel session, and this is where we'd really like your feedback. So we'll be having a panel and we'll be asking for questions for you to post, not just during the panel, but throughout today's session. So if you have any questions that you would like to pose the panel or any comments you'd like to bring up, if you can please use the Q&A at the bottom. So you'll find that's usually at the bottom of your screen, and it looks like 2 speech marks with Q&A at it. Q&A at the bottom, and what you'll be able to do is type your question in there, and then we will try and feed these into our panel discussion, bearing in mind we might not get to all of them, but we'll try and cover the substance and ethos of as many of the questions as we can. So with that, we'll kick off with a video, a short film that was created by the Alliance about what is the menopause. So hopefully, and we all cross our fingers at this point when we're dealing with Zoom, we should be able to play the video. I'll hand over to you, Lindsay, to play it.
Thanks, Kath. Okay, yes, everyone cross your fingers. Okay, let's go with this.
My name is Stephen Callister. I'm one of the consultants at Untitled. In this short clip, I'd like to cover the menopause, what it is, when and why it's different, what are the symptoms, and more importantly, how long does it last. I will mention some common treatment options that you can do for yourself. Finally, I'll direct you to some areas of information and where you can go to get treatment. Becoming menopausal is a natural process, and the term literally means the last menstrual period. The time from when you start to have symptoms until your last period is referred to as the perimenopause, and the time after your last period is called the postmenopause. We only know someone is menopausal when they've 12 months with no periods. Some people have no symptoms whatsoever, and others only experience symptoms once they're postmenopausal. People are born with the egg-producing cells in their ovaries called follicles. These follicles develop during reproductive life to cause ovulation and produce hormones, estrogen, progesterone, and testosterone. The number of follicles decreases with age towards the menopause, and eventually there are so few follicles that not enough hormones can be produced, and the menstrual cycle stops. The average age of the menopause in the UK is 51 years, but really anything between 45 and 55 years is considered normal. There are some factors that affect the time of the menopause, and it can be younger in those with an early puberty, in those who've not had children, and in those who smoke. Around 1 in 100 women under the age of 40 will experience menopausal symptoms, and this menopausal-like state is referred to as premature ovarian insufficiency. This is actually different from the normal menopause in that it can be reversible, whereas the normal menopause is totally irreversible. Most people experience menopausal symptoms for around 7 years, and it is thought that the earlier someone experiences symptoms, the longer they will last. However, many people pass through the menopause with little or no symptoms at all. Most people associate the menopause with hot flushes and sweats, but there are many other common symptoms. The menstrual cycle itself can become shorter or longer, and the periods can become heavier or lighter. The hot flushes and sweats can lead to poor sleep, with tiredness, lethargy, irritability, and brain fog. Some people experience an exaggeration of premenstrual type symptoms, with anxiety, mood swings, and irritability. In the longer term, the menopause is associated with an increased risk of heart attacks and strokes, thinning of the bones, called osteoporosis, and vaginal dryness and discomfort. For the majority of people, no blood test is actually required to diagnose the menopause. The hormone levels can be very erratic at this time. The hormone levels are actually extremely unhelpful. Your GP or practice nurse may cause a menopause at a very young age. In general, you should rely on your symptoms. There are many treatment options available to help you cope with menopausal symptoms. Some people prefer to take hormones to counteract the falling hormone levels in their body. And for others, there may be medical reasons why they need to avoid hormones, such as hormone replacement therapy. There are also non-hormonal options available to help with the symptoms of flushes, low mood, or anxiety. More importantly are the lifestyle choices and changes that you can make yourself, such as stopping smoking, increasing your exercise, and cutting down on alcohol, because these have been shown to reduce the number of flushes and sweats that a person has. It's very important to look after yourself during the menopause and think about the lifestyle factors that you can change, because only you are in control of those changes. Stopping smoking, increasing your exercise, improving your diet, and ensuring your body mass index is within the normal range are all good starters. It's equally important to be kind to yourself and try and reduce as many stress triggers in your life as you can. Many people rely on family and friends for support during the menopause, but there are very good websites available with information regarding complementary and alternative treatments, non-hormonal and hormonal treatments, including the risks and benefits of HRT. These websites include NHS Inform and Menopause Matters.
Lovely. Thanks so much for that, Lindsay. Now, I know we had a problem with the sound there, so thank goodness for the subtitles, but we're also going to put the link to that video should you wish to use it in your own organisations in the chat just now. So please feel free to take a note of that URL, and you should be able to access it after the webinar and also pass it on to anyone in your organisation you wish to. So we're now going to turn to thinking more specifically about menopause in the workplace and overview what we know about it, and perhaps some of the things that we don't know in terms of evidence base. So Lindsay, can I just ask you again to share the screen? That would be fantastic. Just to say thank you so much for all of you putting your question and answers in just now. Please do continue to do that throughout the webinar, and we will turn to these questions during the panel. That's fantastic. Could you just yeah, that'd be great. Perfect. Okay, so what do we actually know about the menopause? So if we just go to the next slide. Great. So I thought it'd be really useful just to overview what we actually know in terms of an evidence base surrounding the menopause at work. And this is really important because there's been a wave of interest and information surrounding menopause in the workplace, probably over the past 2 to 3 years in the UK. But actually, a lot of the discussion has been quite anecdotal in terms of thinking about people's experiences. So I thought it'd be useful to kind of overview some of the things that we know and some of the things that we don't know, and then go into what has the evidence suggested can help support women in the workplace. So the first aspect is that we know that there's a two-way relationship surrounding the impacts of menopause at work. In other words, we know that menopausal symptoms can affect what we call work outcomes. That's things such as work engagement or work satisfaction. But we also know that the work environment can have a significant impact on women's menopausal experiences as well. And I'll go into details of that in a minute. The second aspect is that we know that what we often call micro accommodations can actually have a significant offsetting impact. And so what we find in a range of research from across Western Europe as well as the US is that making small changes to individuals' working environments that really usually cost very little and have very little resource implications can have a significant impact on women's positive experiences of work whilst they're working through menopausal transition. Again, we'll talk a bit more about these in a bit more depth in a minute. The third aspect is that actually we know very little about women in low paid or precarious work, or about minority women's experiences of menopausal transitions in work. So whilst we're starting to build a good picture about women who are generally white, who work in professional settings, usually what we call white collar or office-based settings, we actually know relatively little about women who work in those different settings. And of course, because the environment can play a key component, we need to make sure that we know a bit more about this. And then finally, we know relatively little about SME experiences and some subcontractor relationships. So that may be the SMEs are more or less flexible. We know that there's some great examples of SMEs in menopausal support. We know there's some not so great examples of menopausal support, but we don't know about the specifics of SME experiences because, of course, they often don't have a dedicated HR professional. They may have different occupational and health processes that they have to go through, and so on and so forth. And we also don't know about subcontractor relationships. And this is really important for menopause in the workplace, because when you have a large organisation, such as a healthcare organisation, you may have individuals who work directly for that organisation who are being well supported. And then you have other individuals who work in the same workplace, but by virtue of being employed by a subcontractor are not well supported. So we need to think about these relationships as well. Next slide, please, Lindsay. Okay, so let's go into a bit more depth about these. Well, I think probably all of you attending here know that the menopause is probably one of those aspects that is ubiquitous for people who menstruate, and at the same time a unique experience as well, because there are a number of factors, both biological and physical, but also cultural and contextual and about lifestyle and life course that can affect women's experiences. And from our research, I thought it was useful to put up these kind of opposing experiences. So for people such as Valerie, she said, menopause, no problem, sailed through it. I think this is the menopause that we all want. We didn't have any issues about it. I just breezed through. For other people, for Hannah, she said that it was a significant experience, and she had in particular flooding, which is heavy bleeding. And she said, it was a real challenge because she travelled a lot for her work, and she got to the point where she was thinking, do I have to bring 2 clothes to work? Do I have to, think about what clothes do I have to wear? And how do I kind of work about these aspects that intersect with, of course, a cultural stigma surrounding menopause? For Alana, as for a lot of women, they experience early menopause as a result of either health episodes or medication as a result of a health episode. So we know, tamoxifen, which is a medication that's used for breast cancer, can jettison you into early menopause. So there's a lot of people who are experiencing those significant health episodes, such as cancer, that then get pushed into menopause as well and have to deal with that at the same time. And then for other people such as Diana, in some ways it's a liberating experience. So menopause might be a little bit bothersome, but actually it signals a different stage of their life where they can kind of dedicate perhaps more of themselves to their work or things that they wish to pursue. So really we know that kind of menopause is a unique experience for women, and different women have different effects. Lindsay, next slide, please. Okay, there we go. So as the slide mentioned, symptoms are unique for each woman, but usually the way that we think about them, and it's useful if we're thinking about this in an HR context, they're considered usually in terms of frequency and severity. And that's really important to think about. So some women will experience very frequent, almost daily symptoms, but they're not very severe. Other women may experience severe symptoms, but only every so often. And then some women will experience frequent symptoms that are also very severe. Okay, so we can think about this in different ways. We know that 25% experience no significant symptoms and 25% experience significant, or the medical term is bothersome symptoms. So things that would impede you doing something in your day-to-day life. At the same time, we know that menopause is subject to underdiagnosis, to misdiagnosis and to delayed diagnosis. So even if a woman has went to their GP or healthcare professional, they may have a misdiagnosis. So we, during our research, we heard about women being misdiagnosed of having a brain tumor when it was actually menopause, underdiagnosis, being told that, you know, there wasn't anything wrong, or delayed diagnosis where they had to go to the doctor 3 or 4 times before they were recognized as being in menopausal transition. And this is really important given that our management systems and our HR systems often require that kind of medical evidence for women. So we have to make sure that when we're putting in place HR practices and processes, we know that this is in the context of underdiagnosis, misdiagnosis, and delayed diagnosis in the healthcare sector more broadly. Next slide, please. So what are some of the symptoms? Well, I thought this was useful to put up because we often think about the kind of ubiquitous hot flush as being, you know, what menopause is about. But actually, for working women, we know that sleep disturbance and headaches are usually seen as more significant and more impeding on their day-to-day work life. So sleep disturbance, sometimes due to night sweats, sometimes due to other reasons as well. But we also have a number of other another number of other symptoms as well that can have an impact on work. Next slide. At the same time, we know that a lot of women don't actually know about menopause. So what we sometimes call menopause literacy is not high, especially in the UK. So women usually don't know about it until they hit it or someone in their family hits it. And at the same time, a lot of women feel too, if you just click on it again, Lindsay, a lot of women feel too busy to actually deal with it. So if you think about this happening around 51 years of age, this is a time when women sometimes have dual caring responsibilities. So they have children as well as aging parents. They may have a job that's got high stress demands. They may be supporting a partner who's working through things. So actually taking the time out to proactively manage their own self-care is always further down the list than it should be. Okay, as Daly says, you always put stuff higher up there in the pile of things to do, and I think we can all kind of recognize that pile of things to do that we have. Next slide, Lindsay. So we talk about symptoms in work. Well, there's a number of studies that say that symptoms can have a negative impact on work. The challenge with these studies is that they're rather dated now, and they don't think about the different types of symptoms and also in terms of the significance of severity or frequency. So we know that they can be disruptive to working lives, in particular night sweats, because they affect our sleep, and hot flushes as well. And they're seen as most disruptive. And we also know that work activity, what's it called in the US, impairment related to vasomotor symptoms, that's hot flushes, things that moderate your, don't allow you to moderate your temperature, can change, can have an effect, a kind of cost effect of around $1,000 to $6,000. However, what I would say is that this work is probably not as, how would I say it? It's probably quite dated in terms of how we think about menopause and how we think about workplace cultures, because we actually know that work outcomes are heavily dependent both on the frequency and bothersomeness of how people experience menopause, but also work culture. So we know that work culture can offset a number of these kind of experiences of work activity impairment and also kind of commitment to work as well. Next slide. At the same time, we know that work can affect symptoms, and this is where the workplace has a really key proactive role to play in supporting women's menopausal transition. So we know that workplace temperature and ventilation is key. We know that sometimes the standard temperature is set at what should be a normal body's temperature, and we know that sometimes controlled temperature systems aren't actually that consistent at all. So a number of times women say not being able to control their temperature around them is a key challenge. And also we know ventilation is a problem as well. We also know that job design and workspace design can have an impact. So there's one study from Egypt of teachers and says that static work postures actually aggravate the symptoms. So they make their symptoms worse. So one thing to think about is how is your work design supporting or aggravating symptoms? And then we also know that availability and privacy of sanitary and washroom facilities is really important. Now, we all think about, of course we have toilets in the workplace, of course people are able to use these. Is that the case if people are working shift work? So are the toilets always available and free at 2 a.m. in the morning if that's shift work? Do people know where the sanitary and washroom facilities are if they're going to a meeting in another building, for example? So rather than assume that we always have this availability of sanitary and washroom facilities, making sure that, first of all, we do at all hours of the day that people work in our workplaces, but also making sure that people, no matter where they are in a building, have access to what they see as adequate sanitary and washroom facilities. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there's the cultural aspect as well. So we have work stress, we know, and overload, and of course, stigma can affect job outcomes. And to give an example of this, so someone might be having a hot flush. If you try and hide a hot flush, usually what happens is it gets worse. You feel worse about it. And this is usually due to stigma. Whereas if there's individuals working in a non-stigmatized workplace, they're able to have their hot flush and then kind of move on from it, or able to take 5 minutes out to get some hot, have some cold air outside, get some water, and then it's no big deal. What we do know, however, is that high supervisor support, that means that if your line manager or supervisor is supportive, this is actually independently associated with lower menopausal symptom reporting. And I wanted really to emphasize this because what we have evidence of is that if an individual has higher supervisor support, adequate supervisor and line management support to help them through menopausal transition, then they actually experience the menopause in the workplace differently, okay? So that's a pretty significant finding, that the workplace can actually help positively support not just women going through menopausal transition in the workplace, but their experience of menopause as well. And how are we doing for time, Lindsay? What's the time?
The time is 5 to 11.
Perfect.
So that's what you're fine.
Perfect. That's great. Okay. Next slide, please. Okay, so what can you actually do in the work? You can flip that slide, don't worry. So what can you actually do to start thinking about this? Well, hopefully this webinar should give you lots of kind of tips and techniques as to where you might start thinking about this. We usually use what's called a EAEA model to help organizations start thinking about it. It's embedded, enabled, acknowledged, and accepted. So I'm going to very quickly go through these as a kind of way to start thinking about some of these aspects and how it might affect your workplace that Gillian will of course pick up on and Lindsay will pick up on later. So next slide. So the first one is embedded. Excuse me. So embedded, so this is the idea of how are you actually going to practically integrate it into your working practice. Now, there's two ways that the organisations try to do it. The first one is that they think about, are they going to have a separate policy? So are they going to have a policy that's a menstrual policy, or are they actually going to integrate it into existing practices rather than simply graft on new policies? What I would suggest is that sometimes a separate policy is very good in signalling your support, but if it's a standalone policy that is separate to all your other policies surrounding flexible working and health and well-being, it's probably not going to be super effective. So what I would suggest is that, you have that policy, but you also make sure that you explicitly point to existing policies surrounding, for example, reasonable accommodation and life-friendly policies that may be surrounding flexible hours and spaces. Because we know that good practice surrounding menopausal support is usually good practice for all employees anyway. Okay, there's very rarely that you're doing something that is just going to benefit your employees going through menopausal transition. What you have to make sure is that you're clear on aligning your menopausal approach with strategic objectives of the organisation. So is this, for example, about a gender equity strategy? Is this about, for example, a later life health and well-being strategy? Is it about a talent management strategy? Okay, it depends on your overall strategic objectives, but making sure there's a clear line of thought there makes it incredibly useful when you're trying to onboard at that kind of senior management level. So we all can say, you know, menopause policy or menopause practices to support in the workplace, great thing, but making sure that it speaks the language of your organization in terms of strategic objectives makes it incredibly far more powerful. So next aspect. Now, in terms of embedding it, there's many high-profile organisations that are beginning to introduce menopausal policies, and there's also a range of professional guidance. So ACAS put out some guidance, the Chartered Institute for Personnel Development put out guidance, the European Menopause and Andropause Society put out guidance last year, and finally a research team that I work for put out MIPO, which is Menopause Information Pack for Organisations, and we're about to launch a template for a menopausal policy as well. So you can sign up if you want to receive that as well. One of the contentious issues is whether menopausal leave, and increasingly when we think about menstrual leave, should be in addition to sick leave. And is this actually a good idea or not? And the evidence suggests a very mixed bag. So some people say this is a good idea, others say it leads to further stigmatization and perhaps makes organizations shift those issues of reproductive lives to, to a way out of the organization rather than actually dealing with it in the organization and allowing women to work and continue to participate in the workplace. Okay, next slide, please, Lindsay. So the next one is enabled. So who actually does the labor? Now, this can be surrounding making sure that you do things such as separate your menopause policy and your practices from processes such as performance management. So making sure that there is not just one space that women can disclose their menopausal transition experiences, and that's at the same time as they're discussing performance management, but also make sure that you're awareness raising in terms of your training surrounding menopausal literacy. This should be for all your employees. And also your line management training is vital. So if there's one thing that I'd like you to take away from today, line managers are vital in making sure that the first conversation that a woman has or a person who's experienced a menopausal transition has is affirming and supportive. We're not expecting line managers to know everything about menopause to be able to kind of go and mastermind and choose menopause as their subject. What we're saying is that they need to be able to say, thanks so much for telling me. I'm not sure the answer, but I'm going to get back to you. And then as an organisation, we need to provide an infrastructure that allows them to have a comprehensive space where they can go and get information about what they can provide. Okay. And then finally, we should be checking who's actually doing the labour of championing menopause. So incidentally, sometimes what we find is it's women who are experiencing significant menopause turn into the champions. And in some ways, this feels like an unfair burden of labour where we're asking them to kind of choose and challenge their own experiences of stigmatization. So make sure that you're giving resources to who's championing menopause in your workplace. The next one, very quickly, we have time. So next in the EAEA model is acknowledged. So thinking about how you're acknowledging menopausal transition employees as part of that broader talent pool. So what we advise is that usually you should be thinking about a consideration of capacities and skills, what we sometimes call that second horizons leadership potential. Are you thinking about this cohort of employees who may be going through menopausal transition as a valuable group or cohort of talent in your workplace that you want to keep and you want to actively develop? So again, we found a number of studies where women felt that during menopausal transition, they were at a stage in their life where they were ready to take on additional responsibilities and they were waving their hand about. And where were managers looking? They were looking at men in their 30s as being the next leaders. Okay. So this is about thinking about menopausal support as part of a broader organisational awareness. This may be surrounding life course and women's bodies at work. It may be coordinated with your menstruation or endometriosis policy, or it may be surrounding later life working, how you're going to make sure your talent retention and development for those 50 plus is in place and is working and effective in organisations. And then the final A, if we could just move on, Lindsay. Is accepted. And this is really about practical solutions. And I wanted to finish up here because what we know is that practical solutions have two effects. One is they make menopause not a big deal. And secondly, they make women feel that menopause is not a big deal. They're not problematized. So we have two kind of contrasting stories that we've heard about from our research. And the first one was a woman who was able to get a fan, no problem. She needed a fan in the workplace because, you know, she was working in an air-conditioned, air-controlled workplace that didn't really work for her hot flushes. She asked her line manager for a fan. Next day, it was on her desk, no problem. Another woman was working in a workplace. She asked for a fan. She had to fill out 3 bits of paperwork and wait 1 month to get that fan. Now, who do you think felt most welcome in the workplace? They ended up with their fan, but the cultural messages surrounding it were far more significant, negative for the later women. So thinking about how you can avoid red tape to access those relatively minor resources, thinking about how uniforms may have an inadvertent effect. Natural fibre uniforms we know are better for people going through menopause. Making staff aware of those small inclusivity signals, that it's not a big deal if you have a hot flush, for example, if you need to take, 10 minutes out. Giving kind of small signals such as advanced notification of meeting places and times, so women can perhaps go and scout the room, see where they want to sit in that room, which is best for them, see where the toilets are, for example. Or it may be staggered or broken up lunch hours to help muscular pains. So 2 30-minute breaks rather than 1 hour break. Okay. And I think we'll stop there, Lindsay. So if you have any questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A. But we're going to very quickly move on to Lindsay Millen, who, as I said, is the Policy and Development Manager for Close the Gap, who are helping support this webinar. And she's going to kind of lead on to some of the stuff that some of the kind of practical steps that we were talking about there, about what employers can do to support employees experiencing menopause. I'll hand over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Kath. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully we'll have less issues with the slides behaving during this session. One moment. Here we go. Okay, thanks again to everyone for attending today. So I'm going to talk a bit about the steps that employers can take to provide effective menopause support in the workplace and just creating that menopause aware workplace. But I'm also going to talk about how women's experience of the menopause in the workplace overlaps with gender inequality, and how you can use the actions that you take in one area to help affect change in the other. So first of all, just a quick canter through where we are with gender inequality in the workplace. I really think there's no space for complacency on this. Although gender inequality in the workplace is much higher profile than it was, say, 10 years ago, it's still a factor. We still have a high gender pay gap, and it's much higher in some sectors than others. And women still experience inequality that prevents them from accessing and progressing in employment to the same degree as men. And so there's a range of factors that contribute to this. I've got some examples of these here, but there's plenty to talk about. The first is persistent gender norms that are still a factor that affects women in the workplace. And these kick in from arguably before children are born, with these gender reveal parties that set really clear ideas of what a boy is and what a girl is and what an expectation of a woman is in the workplace compared to men, and ideas about what women can and can't, should and shouldn't do. And so these cause one of the key factors that causes the gender pay gap, which is occupational segregation. There's 2 different types of this. One is commonly known as the glass ceiling, where we see a lack of women in senior roles because of stereotypes about men being more capable of leadership in the workplace. And the other is women's concentration in low-paid work. And the vast majority of low paid work is found in jobs that we know as women's work. So these are highly feminized occupations such as care work, whether that's childcare or care for older or disabled people, cleaning work, admin work, retail work. And all of these types of work are dramatically underpaid and very low paid, often at close or at the minimum wage level, which is not commensurate with the level of the work involved. For example, social care work is extremely complex. Often care workers are dealing with individuals with highly complex multiple needs, dispensing medications. And so for that work to be paid at or close to minimum wage really does not reflect the value of the work. Not just in terms of the value of the work when it's being done, but also the value of the work to wider society. So this contributes massively to women's inequality in the workplace and also wider inequality in the world. And one of the reasons women are concentrated in low paid work is because of their greater responsibility for unpaid care. This is still the case. The gender split of unpaid care, whether that's care for children or also domestic labour in the home, is quite unchanged for the past 20 years or so. And so what this means is women have to balance unpaid care, unpaid domestic labour with paid work. And this is still a massive challenge given the cost of childcare. Full-time childcare often costs more than the average mortgage payment, which is extremely difficult to cope with for many families. And also that lack of flexible working. And most employers have some form of flexible working available now, but very often it's limited in scope. It's limited to one, maybe two types of flexible working. Part-time working is the most common form, and other things like flexi time tend to be there, but we really don't see more creative use of flexible working, such as term time hours and job share to the degree that we would hope. And this lack of flexible working means that women are concentrated in lower paid work because flexible working is more likely to be available in that lower paid feminized work and far less likely to be available in senior levels, which prevents women from progressing in the workplace to the same degree as men, and leaves them with far less choice. And all of these things feed into and are underpinned by workplace cultures that still don't feel inclusive to women. And these are because all of these practical factors, are signaled through that lack of flexible working, and also other factors such as like recruitment processes that have bias creep into them, but also just there's still a high level of sexist attitudes in the workplace, and this is reflected in the persistent high levels of sexual harassment that we see in the workplace. And all of these things combine to send a message to women that they're simply not as valued as men. And this is just a mirror of gender inequality in wider society. But just because it's a societal issue doesn't mean that employers should take it as a given that it will happen and they can't do anything about it. What employers do matters, and you can help it, prevent it from happening in your workplace. So all of these factors that contribute to gender inequality overlap and interweave with the impacts of menopause at work, and also contribute to that power imbalance between women and men. As men age in the workplace, that's associated with perceived increased status and credibility and capability. However, it's the very opposite for women. And that's a result of these gender norms, stereotypes about older and menopausal women, about brain fog and how that impacts on their abilities, and women being taken less seriously and becoming increasingly invisible as they age in the workplace. When we see women pushed into these different types of work without support, employees experiencing menopause may feel compelled to reduce their hours or responsibilities, or even to leave their job altogether. And that sees them pushed into these lower paid jobs where they might have access to flexible working to help them balance help them deal with their responsibilities and their symptoms. And that sees organisations losing those skills, losing those women, and results in increased recruitment and training costs to replace them. So it's bad for employees and it's also bad for employers. Unpaid care, as Kat said earlier, women are increasingly responsible for sandwich caring. So that might be caring for children or grandchildren along with older parents. And this makes it even harder to balance work and care. And combined with menopausal symptoms adds additional stress, and that has a massive impact on women's health. And that lack of flexible working makes it more challenging to deal with these things as well. And it also makes it harder to manage symptoms. For example, flexible working can be really helpful to women when they're having sleep issues or heavy bleeds. So where they can't access that in the form that is useful to them, that makes it more challenging. And again, workplace culture, where that workplace support is not readily available, it sends a message to women that they aren't valued or that their well-being isn't taken seriously. And that creates a workplace culture which just doesn't feel inclusive to women. So many of the issues that I'll talk about in this presentation aren't just relevant to creating a menopause-friendly workplace. They also will help you tackle gender inequality in your workplace. And I'd also just like to add here that action on menopause in the workplace is a really good example of intersectional work. Intersectional work is where you consider the impact of more than one characteristic at the one time. In this case, you're thinking about the characteristics of gender and age and how they interact. And so it's really good quality work on equality when you're thinking about all of these different things. For example, Black and racialised women have very specific experiences of inequality in the workplace, as do younger women, as do older women, as do disabled women. So starting out thinking about how older women and women going through the menopause experience work will help you think about how to do intersectional work more widely. So what can employers do to create a menopause-aware workplace? Well, there's 5 key areas that employers should be thinking about. So that first area is awareness, then thinking about support, what you can do, policy and how you deal with this, how all of this is implemented, and then action planning. So look at these in a little bit more detail. Increased awareness of the menopause and how it impacts women in the workplace is key to ensuring women are able to access the support that they need. And so there are 3 types of awareness raising that you need to think about. The first is communications aimed at all employees. So that can be sharing information on the menopause and how it impacts on women in the workplace through things like all staff communications, posters and leaflets or training. And these really supportive communications, especially where they come from senior leaders, can send a really clear signal to employees and help foster a more inclusive environment by challenging stigma. You should also think about communications aimed at employees who are experiencing the menopause. So this can include issuing an all staff communication, advising what support is available and how to access it. And it's really important that this isn't a one-off because workplace cultures that don't feel inclusive can mean that women feel unable to access or to ask for support, regardless of whether they've been advised that it's available. So it's really important to do comms around this regularly, so it's visible, so employees know that it's something that you're committed to, and that will help them to come forward and access the support that they need. And then the other aspect of awareness raising is sharing information with key people. So you should ensure that your key people have the information that they need to play their part in fostering a menopause-aware workplace. And I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in just a moment. So support. This is really thinking about what is available in your workplace and what you can do. And often it's a lot more than you might think. As Kat was saying, there's some very small adjustments that can be made that can make a huge difference to women in the workplace. So you should really think about building a package of support measures that women experiencing menopause are able to access, and have this all collated, like a list of it all collated in one place. And that'll help you to share information on what support is available, which in turn will make it easier for women to access the support, and also for line managers to know what they have to hand to basically provide to employees. So your support package should include a range of different options. The ability to use flexible working to help them manage their symptoms, having regular one-to-ones with their line manager to discuss well-being and workload and any adjustments they might need. Having menopause-sensitive absence management processes. Now, Kat was talking about this, whether you should have specific leave to do with menopause or not. I think thinking about that, how you can do your absence management processes a little bit more sensitively is a really important thing. And that could include exempting menopause-related absences from trigger-based policies, because women who are experiencing significant symptoms around the menopause can have higher rates of absence. That can leave them exposed to perhaps sometimes unfair and disproportionate absence management processes. So providing support around the menopause can obviously help mitigate those absence levels, but taking a different approach to absence management and just being more sensitive and responsive, as with, for example, pregnancy-related absences, that can be a really helpful and supportive approach to take. Other things to think about include appropriate return to work support after any long-term absences relating to the menopause, access to free period products in bathrooms, including specific products for heavy flow, that's really, really important, ready access to washroom facilities, regular breaks, temperature control in the workplace, for example, as Kat suggested, providing a fan, moving the working location away from a heat source or closer to a window, and also many employers now offer things like employee assistance programs or actually specific counselling sessions to their employees. And this can be really helpful for women who are experiencing significant symptoms and struggling with the mental impact of that. So having policy, whether this is a separate policy or having it built into your existing policies, this is really important to have clarity on your approach and also to demonstrate that visible commitment. So having specific policy will encourage women to ask for support by providing that visible statement on your commitment that you will provide it. And it will also enable, ensure you're able to provide line managers and other people with the support they need to provide that support well. And all of this really just contributes to fostering an inclusive and a safe working environment where women experiencing the menopause feel valued and supported. So your policy should include information on what support is available, including examples, not just saying support is available. And it's really important to demonstrate that you've thought about it by including a range of examples in there. Information on how to request support, your policy on flexible working and how this can support employees experiencing menopause. And again, you could do this by building information on menopause into your flexible working policy itself. Information on how menopause-related absences should be dealt with, or again, you can include this in your sickness absence policy and signpost to that if you have any separate policies on menopause. And also detailing who your organisation's key contact on the menopause is. For example, as Kat mentioned, you might have a menopause champion. There might be a senior manager in your organisation who's taken on that role, which can make a huge difference by giving a legitimacy and visibility. Or you might have an HR manager that's the lead on that. It's important to remember that policy is just one element of best practice. You know, even if you develop the best quality policy possible, if it just sits on a shelf, it's not really good enough. It's not going to have the impact that you want. So you should also think about other things that you can do. And this includes reviewing your other policies to identify if they might have an unintentional detrimental impact on employees experiencing menopause. For example, those trigger-based absence management policies that don't really adjust for menopause-related absences, don't leave any room for those discussions. And if recruitment or promotion decisions have quite a significant discretion-based component, this can really allow bias to creep into decision-making, and stereotypes about menopausal women can then affect their chances of success. So thinking about how all of these issues might interlink with other policies is really important. And next, thinking about implementation, Kat mentioned the role of line managers, and I cannot stress that enough, really. All of the steps we've already talked about are core to creating a menopause-aware workplace, but really, as I mentioned with policy as well, without effective implementation, they just won't create the change that you need. So you do need to ensure your key people receive adequate training so they understand their role and what's expected of them. And line managers should really be a priority group for training, because the supervisor effect, as it's known, is a key factor in effective implementation, because line managers are gatekeepers in the workplace. So your employees' experiences of work, how comfortable they feel accessing or asking for support, and what support they are able to get is all heavily dependent on line managers. So again, regardless of how good your policy is, if line managers aren't aware of them or don't feel confident implementing them, or if there again is significant discretion involved in decision making around that, they might not be fully effective. So you need to ensure line managers are trained in the policy and in how to support staff experiencing menopause. That's not just making them aware of the policy, but also the organisational expectations of how it should be applied, because that approach is key. Line managers must understand the menopause as a legitimate reason for needing support in the workplace and take a positive and open approach to providing this support in their teams. And it's also important to remember, that line managers might be uncomfortable discussing menopause, especially if they're men. So awareness raising and good policy can provide that information to support understanding. But you also need to build their confidence in talking about menopause with employees and managing those conversations sensitively. And another key group is HR. HR staff should also be trained in how to implement policy around menopause, so they are able to provide effective advice to line managers, and also support employees who are experiencing it and maybe signpost them to where they can get support. HR staff provide essential support in the workplace, and they've got a really positive role to play in ensuring women are able to access the support that they need. So finally, action planning. The best way to create a menopause aware workplace is to develop an action plan on it. Action plans are crucial to ensuring your work in this area is strategic, clearly mapped out and measurable. So your plan should, as with any action plan, set out what you want to achieve, what actions you'll prioritise, crucially, who's responsible for delivering each action, when they'll be delivered by, and how you'll track progress. Now, progress tracking and accountability measures are key to ensuring focus is maintained on this, and the plan doesn't lose momentum as other priorities arise, because we've all seen cases where organisations have developed an action plan on equality or pay gap or something else, and it's fallen by the wayside because every day priorities change, workloads increase, so it's really important to be able to main focus on that. And again, picking up on the point that Kath made about who's doing the work, it's really important to think about this. Lots of employers will have employee networks or groups focused on particular aspects of equality. This might be gender equality, it might be menopause, and these groups are really positive, but it's important not just to think about these groups as the people who will deliver this work. Engagement of this type is only valuable to the people who are doing it if they have the power to influence and to create change in the workplace. Otherwise, they're just talking shops, especially when participation in these groups is unpaid and it's not done during working time, it's done on top of their job. So this is not to say that the lived experience of women experiencing menopause is not important, and it's really important to build ways of raising those voices into your processes, but it's just not on them to deliver the changes that need to happen in the workplace. These need to be resourced, committed to, and managed by employers. And so there's key considerations for different employers in different sectors. We've got a range of resources for employers that can support these different considerations that really depend on whether you're in the private sector, in the third sector, the public sector, if you're a large employer or a small employer, and the different sectors, again, like construction or retail or finance that you might be working in. All of these things affect what type of support is appropriate and available. And so there's a wide range of resources available to do that. The actions I have mentioned here can have a really positive impact on gender equality in your workplace, but taking that wider action is really important. So as I mentioned at the start, the impact of menopause in the workplace is really underpinned by the persistence of gender inequality in the workplace and what this means for women's experiences. So also, although all of these actions I've mentioned are menopause specific, you can easily widen them to consider not just the impact of menopause, but also the impact of inequality on all women in the workplace. For example, you could include information on women's greater responsibility for unpaid care and training that you deliver to line managers on managing flexible working, and ensure they take a positive approach to all flexible working requests. You can undertake a review of your policies to identify where they might have a differential impact on women and men and make changes to address this. And you could carry out an objective review of the culture in your workplace and be willing to be challenged and honestly confront any issues you identify. So we've got a range of resources for employers who want to take action in these areas. Close Your Pay Gaps for larger and third sector employers who have to publish their pay gap, and it talks about how you can use that information to develop action. Think Business, Think Equalities for smaller employers, and it produces tailored solutions to the sector, the size of the organisation to help them deliver equality. And there's also a new resource in there on tackling workplace sexual harassment. And we've also got guidance for public bodies on how to implement the public sector equality in their workplace. And as Kat mentioned, the Menopause Information Pack for organisations is also available, which overlaps really nicely with all of these in terms of thinking about that intersectional work. So we'll share links to all of these with participants after the webinar, along with the recording and the new briefing that Close the Gap have developed on the menopause in the workplace. So that is all from me, and I will stop sharing my screen now and hand back to Kath.
Lovely, thank you so much, Lindsay. Okay, we're going to move quickly on to Gillian Longmire. As I said, Gillian is a head of people at Blue Triangle, which is a social care organisation that delivers solutions in connected communities which focus on the needs of individuals. And it's great to have Gillian here to talk from the coalface, so to speak, about her experiences of delivering workplace support surrounding menopausal transition. So I'll hand over to you, Gillian. And just to remind everyone, if you keep on putting those questions in the Q&A for our panel discussion, we'll get to them after Gillian's finished her presentation. Over to you, Gillian.
Thank you, Kat. That's great. I will just share my screen. Hopefully all this technology works third time round. So following on from everything that Kat and Lindsay have covered, I wanted today to almost bring an example to life for people, which is, an example in an organisation that I actually worked in previously, where I introduced policies and guidance, etc., to managers and employees, etc., around menopause, and how can we really move forward and support everyone in the right way. So I think up front I wanted to say, there is no right way of doing this. I think you have to be really mindful of the context that you're working in, the environment that you work in, and just the culture around your own organisation. But today is just an example of my experience, and I'm hoping that in sharing that helps you to really think about how you could implement it in your own organisation. So the work that I did in a previous organisation was back in sort of 2020, right in the midst of all the pandemic. But really for me, it was such an important topic on the basis that I myself started going through early menopause at 38. I'm now 44. And for me, I had quite a long journey. Unfortunately, as Kat said earlier, I was one of those people who experienced every possible symptom, and I still experience every possible symptom. And I had quite an uphill battle to be taken seriously because I was so young at the time in relative terms. So again, there was a real passion behind why I wanted to really raise the profile of menopause at that time. And I think, as you'll know through the media, it has just really, the profile has raised considerably over the past couple of years. So I will be taking the practices that I used in a previous organisation into my new role now at Blue Triangle. And that previous organisation was hospitality, but I'm actually in the third sector now. So a lot of what I did and I implemented is actually very transferable. It's just about being mindful about your culture and the organisation that you work for, and the kind of working arrangements, as Kat and Lindsay both referred to. So yeah, so I'll just move on. There we go. So, you know, what steps did I actually take? So for me, it was important to get senior leader buy-in. For the people at the top to understand what menopause is, the impacts it can have on employees, and therefore productivity at the end of the day for you know, delivering business. And for me, it was probably advantageous that I could share my own personal journey, my own personal experience with senior leaders to say, this is the impact it can have, this is how it made me feel, and I'm sure there's lots of other women out there who have experienced something similar. And because, you know, it has had such a high profile in the media, I wanted to make sure that it wasn't just a tick in the box exercise or a token gesture. I really wanted to make sure that, you know, the senior leaders really genuinely understood it and genuinely wanted to support the employees working for the organisation. So then I looked at research, I looked at creating a policy, I put guidance about together for managers, I put guidance on all the kind of, not all the possible adjustments, but the main ones that tend to come up, and what we could do as an organisation to support people. I put in place a menopause champion, and then I looked at creating a menopause cafe. So I'll run through each of those areas and let you know what I did. Okay. So first of all, before I set off doing anything, I really concentrated on my research. It was very much about, you know, I had probably a very good understanding. As I said, I had my own personal experience. My mother and my grandmother had gone through early menopause. So to be fair, I was actually quite well prepared. I knew it was coming, and genetically, it kind of, or hereditary, you know, it tends to be that way. So I was in a fortunate position. But I had friends round about me who didn't have a clue, didn't know what was coming. So, you know, I was very much about throwing myself into the research, really looking at all different sources of information. So I read copious amounts of articles, I read books, I searched the web, I watched videos, I joined lots of webinars like this one today. And that was about ensuring that I had enough information and knowledge and research to then be able to enter into writing a policy. And I think that's hugely important at the beginning. And I think, you know, there's so much information out there, you could be overwhelmed. So it's about go out, get your information, and then bring it all back into, well, what's relevant to this organisation. I looked at well-known sources. So, for example, NHS have lots of guidance there. Davina McCall, we all know who she is, and she's, you know, really done a lot about raising the profile of menopause out there. The Menopause Cafe, as I say, I did create one, but actually if you look up the Menopause Cafe, it's a principle that is applied, and you can take that principle and deliver it into your organisation. Henpecked, Meg's Menopause, and Menopause Matters, and the video that we saw right at the beginning of today's session, these were kind of given as examples as well. So just give yourself time to digest, stick to well-known sources so that you know you're getting the right information. But also I think what's really key, and I can't emphasise this enough, keep in mind your organisational culture and your environment, because you need to work through what will work for your organisation, because what works someplace might not work somewhere else, depending on how the work is delivered. You know, yeah, well, the other thing to look at is your environment predominantly male or female? That might adjust how you deliver your messages. Is it an office-based environment, or is it an environment where there's lots of shift working? As I said, it was hospitality, so it was a 24/7, 365 delivery service. So that might be slightly different if you were working on a Monday to Friday office-based environment. So, you know, some of the adjustments you might need to consider to be different. But I'll come back to some of those sort of considerations later on. So when I started looking at the policy, I think it was, I wanted to be clear about who is this policy for. So for me, it's all employees experiencing the menopause, help for managers managing employees who are experiencing menopause, but I think also for those who are supporting someone who's experiencing menopause. I wanted my policy to be quite inclusive. So, you know, there might be a young person whose mother is going through menopause and they're struggling to cope and support that person. You know, so, and or a man who maybe has a female partner, and how can he support his partner through that transition. So for me, I wanted to make sure my policy went just a little bit wider than only to those employees that are experiencing menopause, because for me it was about raising the awareness of the impact it can have and how we can all support each other. I wanted to explain why it's important to have the policy. So, you know, the impact on the person and those around them, and the impact on the work that that person does. I wanted to talk about what support is available. So as both Kat and Lindsay, you know, alluded to, we've got occupational health in some organisations. Have a nod to your flexible working policies. Talk about absence management and how you might treat absences related to menopause. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's what's right for your organisation. But be really clear and really upfront about whether it is or is not included. How your organisation will treat menopause. And then we certainly had an EAP service, so an employee assistance programme, which delivered counselling, etc. So again, that's an additional support to people. So it's about signposting to the right things. And then talking about roles and responsibilities, I thought was incredibly important, because as someone going through menopause and menopausal symptoms, you actually personally have a responsibility to help and do something for yourself, to get the right information, get the right help, go to a GP, go to, you know, a counselling or whatever that might be. And then the responsibility for managers as well. So what is their responsibility? Just be really clear about that so that everyone can understand, you know, how we can all support each other. And then directing to useful resources so that employees can actually do some of their own research. You know, it's all one thing providing information, but some people like to take that information in different ways. They might like to go away and do their own research. So just signpost and let people go away and digest and learn for themselves. I think that's really important. Okay. So guidance for managers. For me, this, and again, Lindsay and Kat have covered all of this, but you know, it's just so important to raise the awareness. There might be managers out there who have never experienced menopause. They've maybe never spoken about it before. They maybe don't even know what it is. They don't know anyone who's been through it, gone through it. They might be thinking, wow, this is coming to me at some point. So, you know, I better get myself informed so that I can support others, but actually I can be informed for myself. So the guidance for managers is really important. Explain what menopause is. What are the symptoms? And in the guidance that I've provided, I've kind of pulled out the main broad symptoms. And as Kat said in her presentation, she kind of highlighted what all of those symptoms, kind of the main ones are. What is the role of the manager? What is the expectation of the organisation on a manager supporting people with menopausal symptoms? And then I also included a part about having sensitive conversations. So regularly in HR, we'll talk to managers about having performance management conversations, about providing feedback, but actually active listening is a huge part of those conversations, but it can be adapted for these sensitive conversations if someone's not comfortable coming forward, or in fact, as a manager, you notice changes and differences and you might want to say to the person, I noticed you potentially had a hot flush. You know, would you like to talk about that? And so having sensitive conversation is really important to have that within that guidance. Risk assessments, so looking at the person's environment, looking at the working environment and what can be adapted and changed to help and support people. And then really key, an area, a section in the guidance around adjustments. Actually, what I did was pull out a separate document about adjustments, and I'll cover that in a moment or two. Managing performance, again, Kat and Lindsay alluded to it. It's around managing performance and how is it linked? If someone's performance dips because they're experiencing really severe symptoms, then what does that mean for the manager when they're managing that person's performance? What does it mean overall for that employee? So just being really clear about all of that. And I included practical tips for supporting employees. And then importantly, is about menopause and the law. Just, what are our responsibilities around health and safety for our employees, for the well-being of our employees, and making sure that you're raising the awareness through that guidance. Okay. So guidance on adjustments, that was the next part that I spoke about there. So what I created was a separate document that was really, and I've given an example on that slide there. You know, I wanted to provide examples of symptoms, then examples of workplace factors which could worsen or interact with the symptoms, and then provide some suggested adjustments. Albeit it's not an exhaustive list, and I think in lots of different organisations you can think very creatively about these things, but also I think it's important managers should listen to the person that's experiencing them, because if you're actually going through it yourself, you might very well have a really creative idea, or you might come up with something that's not been thought about, but it's at least a framework for managers to kind of work through and have something to refer to, especially if they really don't know where to start. So yeah, as I say, it's not exhaustive, but you know, just one size doesn't fit all as well. You know, it's really important to listen to people, listen to the people who are experiencing it, and say, you know, what would work for you, and let's work through it. And as you know, you may have several employees or several people in your team, but they'll actually need something different, and you've got to approach each situation independently and see what's right for that person and the job that they do and whatever they need to deliver. As I said at the very beginning, I looked at creating a menopause champion, and I suppose I was actually quite lucky in the environment that I was in, that our menopause champion was actually a senior leader, and she was someone who was almost coming out the other end of menopause. She'd been through that whole journey, and she, like me, felt very passionately about the support she did and didn't receive at different parts, the experience through HRT, for example, and how, you know, it didn't work for her, but she found alternatives. So she came with a lot of experience. So I think I was quite lucky to get somebody like that. Doesn't have to be a senior leader, just someone who I probably would suggest has been through it, who has a full understanding of what that is. I created a role profile, so it was very much around, you know, what was the type of person that I was looking for to be that champion, and I advertised that like any other role. But obviously it's in addition to the substantive role that the person was employed to do. So, you know, making them aware that this was an additional support and an additional responsibility, but unpaid. You might want to do something very different in your organisation. That was just the approach that I took. Then, yeah, I think you might want to consider if more than one person comes forward. Might you, if you're geographically spread as an organisation, would you maybe want to have, you know, several across areas, or, you know, is it shift working? Would you want maybe one who's available through the day and one who's available through the night? Again, that really just comes down to your working environment and what works for you. But basically, the main thing was that I wanted to facilitate an open and understanding working environment where women are encouraged to talk and discuss menopause. And also, in addition to the champion, you know, the champion wasn't left there out alone. They had the support of the HR team, occupational health, mental health first aiders. You know, there was a kind of almost like a team, a support network there, but that the champion was available for not only people who were experiencing menopausal symptoms, but also managers who maybe wanted to go and say, I have an employee here, you know, can I maybe talk some stuff through? Or I'm a manager and I'm experiencing it, and I know I'm not, you know, managing my team very well because the symptoms are having an impact. They might want to go to that menopause champion rather than going to the HR team. I was really keen that this was not an HR initiative. I wanted it to come from people experiencing it themselves and not be a tick in the box or a waggy finger that was, this is HR telling you we've got to adopt this policy. I wanted to make sure it was embedded and it became part of working practice. In terms of the menopause cafe that I created, it was about creating a space that was accessible, respectful, and a confidential space where people who were experiencing menopause or people who wanted to know more about it could go along and have a coffee and have a discussion around menopause. I wanted it to be open regardless of age or gender. You know, I had young women come along because they were worried about the future and they wanted to be well informed and they wanted to talk to people experiencing it. The whole point of the cafe is not really about providing advice, etc. It's about creating that network, and that network work together. They talk together. It's not, you know, they just come in, have a coffee, a bit of cake, and they really just talk about, oh, did you know about this? Oh, have you read this article? Have you, you know, how are you feeling today? You know, just creating that support network. So there's no intention of leading to any conclusion or recommending products or a course of action. It is simply to provide a safe space for people to come and have support round about them. The membership of that started quite small and it grew over time as word got around. We advertised through our intranet. Feedback from attendees, they shared it in their own chat, sort of online chat, etc. So it kind of just, it grew because of the success of it. And yeah, you'll just need to think about how you set that up. How does that work for you? Does it need to be virtual because you're geographically spread? Or if you could have a cafe in different locations at different parts of the year? And the frequency of that, again, you just have to determine that for yourself as an organisation. So Q&A, but I know obviously you've all been firing your questions into the Q&A chat, so I'll hand back to Kat. But hopefully this has just given a really good overview of an experience that I've had and how successful that was.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Gillian. That was brilliant just to see how you practically implemented such a successful policy in practice. Okay, so we have 10 minutes for questions, and we've got a plethora of questions. What we'll do is we're going to go into a very quick fire panel session. For any of those questions that we don't get round to, what we'll do is we will be using them as a basis for for a blog post next week, and Lindsay will be sharing that with all participants. That's correct, isn't it, Lindsay? Perfect. Okay. Okay. So I'm just going to very quickly rattle through these, and I'll call on Lindsay and Gillian for help with them. So there was a couple of questions about accessing training. So there are a number of training providers out there surrounding menopause. So Henpicked is probably the largest on the market at the moment. There's also the ones that I know, Sally Weiss of Rowan Consulting. She was actually the founder of Menopause Cafe that Gillian mentioned. So Rachel provides training versus Rowan Consultancy, and also Sarah Williams at Equality Council. There's a number of providers out there, but what I would say is that kind of a lot of people successfully provide their in-house training through giving their HR managers and people managers resources to upskill and learn. And in some ways, for some organisations, that's the better approach. For others, it's great to kind of buy in that. Would you say that that's a fair enough comment, Gillian?
Yeah, absolutely. So having worked in an HR function, we decided the training was best rolled out by us rather than going to an external. But again, it'll depend on the size of your organisation, the support that you've got, and actually the capacity to deliver that training. So yeah, I would say all the places that you've suggested there, absolutely, they're great sources for trainers. Brilliant.
Yeah. So there was another question. How can you support individuals whose performance is affected by lack of concentration, brain fog, memory loss, when it's difficult to remove some responsibilities due to lack of resources? It's a great question, because that's really where the rubber hits the road sometimes, isn't it? Gillian or Lindsay, would you like to respond to that?
I'm happy to come in first on that. I would say that's about really just ensuring that your performance management processes aren't too rigid. And, you know, we talk a lot about, you know, having discretion in decision making can have a negative impact in some ways, you know, if biases can creep in, but also having the discretion to flex performance management systems and not adhering to the bell curve approach that often underpins them can be really important. And it's also important to think about job design is not rigid, and you can actually be a lot more creative around job design than you often think. And it's just about taking that kind of step back and thinking, well, can this be done differently? Even if resources are tight, you know, looking at job design and how other roles connect can also often lead to really creative solutions.
Mm-hmm. Gillian, would you like to come in there at all?
I fully agree with Lindsay, and I think, yeah, it's about that rigidity of the process and just being mindful that this is a moment in time for a lot of people. It's not forever, and just being supportive. It might take a slightly longer for certain objectives to be delivered, and that's okay. And having that two-way dialogue with the individual about that.
Yeah, great. So next question. So about, and this relates to sensitive conversations, which I think you mentioned, Gillian. And so how do you approach people who do not connect their behaviour change with the menopause? And how would a male manager approach this? So I mean, this is a really great question. I mean, what I would kind of note in that is what we've seen from research across, you know, a number of countries is that, you know, don't assume where your allies are, because sometimes you can have, you know, a woman of 50s who may have gone through menopause, and if she's breezed through it, she might actually be the least sympathetic line manager. And then you may have kind of a young male line manager who has had, you know, a partner, a kind of parent or someone that they know go through menopause who is hugely knowledgeable. So kind of sometimes don't assume your allies, and don't assume your potential challenges as well. But do you have any advice there for Gillian surrounding how do you approach people who do not connect their behaviour change with the menopause?
Yeah, so that is quite a tricky one, because you don't want to walk in a room and say, I think you've got the menopause, you're in the middle of the menopause. But yeah, I think it goes back to your education and your training around menopause. So your policy, your practice, how you communicate that, keeping that live, keeping it, you know, constantly available, you know, not just a policy that sits on the shelf. So I think your education and your training is particularly important. But, you know, how the use of your language around, you know, if it's affecting performance, if it's affecting absence, it's affecting the person's delivery every day, if they're coming late to work, that's how these conversations come about. The environment in which you have these conversations is really important. You know, go somewhere really quiet, go off site, have a coffee, you know, encourage the person to be as open and transparent as possible. Your menopause champion, if the manager, you know, is worried about the conversation, doesn't know how to go about it, speak to your HR team, speak to your menopause champion if you've got one, and talk to them about that. And then don't be afraid to open the conversation, but just do it in a sensitive way, not just in with two left feet, you know, just have the conversation. There's nothing wrong with asking a question around, you know, I've noticed this, how are you feeling? What symptoms do you have? You know, and sometimes that conversation then will just transpire. But it is a tricky one, and build that sensitive conversation into your policy and into your training so that managers know how to go about it.
Yeah, great. So we had another, I'm very aware of time. So one of the questions is, are we seeing an increase in employment tribunal cases that include menopause aspects to the claim? So if I can just quickly talk about this. So just to give you an overview, in 2021, there was 21 employment tribunals that actually mentioned menopause, but actually around them, there was only around probably 8 that had menopause cited as a particular, you know, one of the kind of key aspects of the employment tribunal cases. Usually menopause is currently kind of covered under disability discrimination. So that's where it kind of rules in terms of the... okay, sorry, it's my daughter's first day at school, so she's just come back. So sorry about that. So usually it's covered under disability discrimination. That's not unusual, because what we actually saw with gender sex discrimination, when that started in the 70s and early 80s, that came to the employment tribunal courts under disability discrimination as well. But what I would say is that kind of, first of all, no one wants to end up in court, but we also know from employment tribunal, if an employer has not disclosed to you, then it's very difficult for the case to go forward. Okay, so there has to be some element of disclosure. Make sure that disclosure isn't kind of hidden somewhere. So, you know, they've disclosed somewhere in an absence procedure, but HR or their line manager never see it. So make sure that you're connecting the dots together. And also, we know if the organisation has made reasonable accommodations, has made an attempt to make accommodations, they will usually find in favour of the organisation. conversation. So I think employment tribunals are not something to be scared about. No one wants to end up in one, but I think it's about making those micro accommodations and making sure you have that inclusive culture where you can have those conversations, because I'm sure Gillian will find this, in a vast majority of cases, those micro accommodations have significant effects, both in terms of offsetting, but also challenging the stigma that we have surrounding menopause at work and making it not such a big deal. Does anyone have anything else to cover there? No? What I'm going to do is I'm going to close down the Q&A. Thank you so much to everyone asking those questions. And as I said, what we're going to do is we'll be forming the basis of our blog for next week, and all participants will have access to that blog when we close off. I think by email, is that correct, Lindsay? You'll be sending it via email. Okay, so before we close, I want to say, first of all, a big thanks to Close the Gap and Scottish Government, especially to Felicity and Sarah, who have been in the background, making sure that everything runs smoothly. And also thank you to Gillian for sharing an invaluable insight into these experiences. And before we go, I just want to highlight there's an Alliance event from 11 to 12 UK time on Wednesday, the 24th of August, which will be held on Zoom. And people can could you send the email, Lindsay? That's in particular not for employers, but for employees, if that's right. Is that right? Or it's basically for women and people experiencing menopause more generally. So if you want to kind of use this to signal to your employees to start having the conversation, that would be incredibly valuable. And then finally, just to reiterate what Lindsay said about Close the Gap, they have a forthcoming resource for employers that sets out those 5 steps for creating a menopause aware workplace. And that will be shared with all attendees next week, again, via email. So in the meantime, I want to once again thank you, thanks to the panelists and organisers, and thank you so much to the 200 plus employers that joined us today. I hope you've had an incredibly valuable experience, and we all very much look forward to further exchanges and communications with you as you try and successfully embed menopause support into the workplace. Thank you and have a good afternoon.